in a perfect world, it would be like sandwiching the bat between two pieces of
like a
plywood or something.
panini press.
Yeah, squishing it down flat, sliding it into the place, and then pulling those two flattened
Yeah,
boards
good luck
out.
inventing
Yeah.
that. Come back and tell us when you finish
Yeah.
inventing that, Justin.
Welcome to the Fine Home Building Podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. To my right is Mr. Martin Holladay with us from Green Building Advisor. Say hello, Martin.
Hi.
And to my left, Patrick McComb, our senior editor and all things tool-related expert, all-around good guy.
Really?
No.
I don't think so.
And me, I'm Justin Fink. So Martin is joining us today because he's in town from Vermont to talk about some. He's not just here for this podcast. Is what I'm trying to say. But while he was here, we thought we would snag him because he came down to town to talk about his website, greenbuildingadvisor.com, that he's the editor of, and it has just recently gone through a redesign and relaunch. So you guys came into the office to do a little housekeeping and following up on some of the little remaining to-dos. But we thought we'd scoop you up and share a little bit with the audience who might not know about Green Building Advisor, what it is and what has changed in this long-awaited and much-anticipated redesign.
Well, yeah.
When did it launch originally?
8 years ago.
Okay.
Roughly. And we've always had an imperfect website, frankly. It was launched on a platform called Drupal. I'm not an expert on web platforms, but very soon after it was launched, people began to realize that the Drupal platform was obsolete. Mm-hmm. And we kind of lacked the resources to completely redesign it from the ground up until a major push that was started more than a year ago.
Can I interrupt you, Martin? Maybe we should tell people what it is first.
Sure. Green Building Advisor is a website for anyone interested in energy efficiency or green building, which means environmentally conscious or environmentally responsible building. Mm-hmm. People who want their homes to perform better than average from an energy perspective and perhaps to be gentler for the planet. Mm-hmm. And most of the website is free. And we have a free Q&A column in which we answer questions from readers. We have daily blogs, we have news stories, and we also have a section of the website which is behind a paywall for subscribers only that has more in-depth articles, including my weekly blog and architectural details for architects and designers. So that's what we offer. The new website is better in many ways than our problematic old website. Most importantly, it's smartphone friendly. It's formatted in a way that it looks good on smartphones. It works for smartphone users, and we all know that that's the way the internet is being accessed by more and more people, especially younger builders who have a smartphone in their pocket on the job site and need to pull up information quickly. So that's great because the old website was more or less formatted for a laptop-style reader. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge difference. In addition, all kinds of features work better. The search feature works better. It looks better. It's faster. It has user-friendly features that the old website didn't have. For example, if you want to subscribe to a thread, it will give you notifications in your email inbox. A new comment has been posted. We didn't have that before. And probably more things than I can list briefly, but it's a great improvement.
Does that same notification of threads work for the Q&A section as well?
Yes, it does.
I got to tell anybody who's not checked out, I mean, it's almost like if you're searching for something even remotely building science related, one of the top search results always seems to be from Green Building Advisor. So you may have gone there and not even realized you've been there before. But if you haven't gone there and checked out the Q&A section, it is deep and thorough, and some of the smartest builders and designers and engineers are in there answering questions with a super high level of expertise for no money.
You can trust the information
it's
there.
really
unlike
excellent.
so much information on the web.
Yeah,
well, thank you.
So many other places, it's just like it gets kind of curmudgeonly. Like people going, "You don't need all that. Just do this." Or "This is the way I used to do it." And
What what
this
I
place
value,
they really push at each other.
yeah, what I value is when someone is totally off base, the other participants in the conversation will call them on it. So you know what information is good and what is suspect.
Right.
And we also try to do it in a gentle way, where we're not calling each other names, where we're correcting people who make innocent mistakes because they're newbies in a way that just builds community instead of building rivalries and anger.
Sure.
And I'm really pleased with the tone of discourse on the web forum, which is different from a lot of web forums where people tend to get personal and very bitter about their disputes.
Yeah,
the discussion is very civil.
It's been very professional on there. It's always taking exception with things that somebody has said, never with the person that anything that I've read. So it's really excellent. As you might guess, and as you've probably heard from other times Martin's been on our show, there's a lot of common questions, and those are usually very well linked to long articles on the site by Martin or other people that are constantly updated and refreshed, and if there's new understandings about that topic, it's rolled in. If there's things that were wrong, it's corrected. So it's kind of like this living, breathing compendium of advanced building, which is really cool.
Well, after 8 years, I've written more than 400 articles, and that's a kind of me and, of course, many other bloggers and experts have contributed guest blogs. So by now we have so many articles on so many topics that we can often answer a question with a link to an in-depth look that is for that specific question.
Yeah, it's excellent. Anyway, so we have Martin here today because we've got some building science questions, and we saved them up until Martin came to town. So without further ado, we will jump in. The first one is about installing a heat pump at high elevations. I was really hoping that we would force Patrick to answer this one. I might butcher this name. Is it Micah? I think it's Micah.
I think it's Micah too.
Micah writes, "Hey guys, this question is a follow-up on the discussion you had a few weeks ago regarding high-efficiency furnaces for the fellow in Colorado. Most of you chimed in that a heat pump would be the simplest solution. I live at 5,000 feet, and I'm looking to replace a 20-year-old furnace. I like the idea of installing a heat pump, but have heard that they don't make sense at higher elevations due to lower humidity. First question, is this true? Second question, if it is true, how would you go about deciding what the best option would be from a cost standpoint as well as an ecological standpoint?"
Well, I can answer the first question pretty easily. They certainly make sense at high elevations, but you have to take some considerations in mind when you're designing the system because at 5,000 feet, the atmosphere is thinner, which means it's less dense at a high elevation compared to sea level. So therefore, the air has less capacity to store heat per unit of volume. So if you're looking at the CFM flowing through the outdoor unit of a heat pump or an air conditioner, the cubic feet per minute is the same at all elevations, but the cubic feet at a high altitude, thin air location will hold less heat. And there are correction tables that are published. I looked it up, and you need 19% more airflow in CFM at a 5,000-foot elevation than at sea level.
And is that across the board, Martin, or is that a particular unit that you looked up?
That is across the board, although if you go to the manufacturer, most of them have what they call expanded performance data sheets, which apply specifically to high altitudes. And what you'll look up is the BTUH capacity of the unit you're considering at sea level will be a lower capacity at 5,000 feet. So all you have to do is choose the right capacity for your manual J or your heat load or your cooling load at that elevation using these expanded performance data sheets or using a correction factor based on percentage. Both methods can work. And usually we all know that if you're choosing the capacity of a unit, you don't have to be dead on. You could be a little bit oversized. Sure. 10, 20, even 30% oversizing is no problem. So don't worry too much about being dead on, but you do have to be aware that you will have to take that into account.
So you need more, to paraphrase, you need more heat pump than you would at a lower elevation.
Right, a slightly larger unit to serve the same capacity.
And would you say, in general, if you're doing rule of thumb sizing, which we don't generally recommend, that it's better to err on the side of 20 to 30% over what you need, just at, let's say, a standard installation?
Well, you don't ever want to do rule of thumb sizing. That's the actual answer.
That's the actual answer.
If you follow Manual J, it does include a oversizing factor in the formula.
Okay.
So you don't have to go over that. If you go as high as 10 or 20%, even 30%, you're not going to get into major problems. When you really oversize it, 100% oversizing is very common in America.
Even factors.
Even 200%
Yeah.
oversizing. And that causes problems because your oversized air conditioner will not dehumidify as well as a right-sized
And it'll
unit.
short cycle. It'll turn on and off more rapidly than it would if it was appropriately sized, hurting efficiency further.
And it'll cost more money. So there's all kinds of ways that right-sizing matters. So do the calculations.
Yeah.
And I thought I'd point out, if he's comparing a heat pump to a furnace, and this is something I don't know much about, but because, as they say, of the change in the mass flow of the gas-air mixture to a gas burner, a gas furnace also has a different capacity at a higher elevation than a lower elevation. So if he's comparing a furnace to a heat pump, both of them have to be sized for high elevations.
I was surprised that it's that much more capacity you need at what is not really that high of an elevation. 5,000 feet is not that high. It's certainly higher than we are here in southern New England, but it's not the Rockies.
Right. Right. But, we do live at the bottom of a fish tank, and we don't realize what high air pressure we have at sea level because we're breathing it all the time.
Yeah.
But if you've ever done much climbing at 10,000 feet, you know that the human body notices pretty quickly. And if you're gasping at 10,000 feet, your heat pump may be too. So, and 5,000 feet is halfway there.
The say again what the name of the data sheet is that people can look for.
It's usually called an expanded performance data sheet, and just contact the manufacturer. And most reputable HVAC contractors should know this, but actually the idea of a reputable HVAC contractor may be an oxymoron. They're hard to find.
Yeah, certainly shrinking by the day, but
certainly
they're out there.
Someone who works in Colorado should certainly know this.
Yes, one would hope.
So I guess, and the second part of the question, does it make sense? Yes, they make a lot of sense, but is it the best choice for your particular location? It depends on a lot of factors. I mean, do you have natural gas? Is natural gas cheap? It's often hard to beat the cost of natural gas heating. It depends on what your electricity price is. And so if you're going just on the cost basis, I would do the math. From an environmental perspective, most green builders are going to all-electric homes now, realizing that the grid is becoming more and more environmentally friendly. It's becoming closer and closer to an all renewable grid, and we may get there in 20 years, at which point, it's going to be the carbon intensity of electricity is dropping every year. And we don't really want to be burning fossil fuels for many more years if we want to save the planet. So that's a factor.
All right. Let's go to one that will shock and surprise you. Heat transfer on a shed roof. And I mean a roof of a shed. So Tim writes to us, "Hey fellas, I have a storage shed project in my future this fall. My design is roughly the same size and shape as Justin's budget-friendly shed from Fine Homebuilding issue 258, but I'm going to add an attic floor. The thought is that my two young girls will use the attic as a playhouse, treehouse, and when they get a little older and no longer use it, I can reclaim the space for storage. Bill's hot porch roof question from episode 129 got me thinking about the temperature in this space. The shed is going to be an unconditioned space, and I plan to have continuous soffit vents and a ridge vent. The design has a shed dormer with awning windows. What else can I do to limit the heat gain in the attic play place? And kind of a side question, since I'll have two small noggins close to the underside of the roof, I'll need to address the nails coming through the roof deck from the shingles. Maybe there's a solution that will help with both at the same time." We have a little drawing of this shed. Looks like a little
It's very handsome.
Isometric drawing or something funky.
I like the shed dormer.
Yeah. Looks like it goes right up to the ridge, so that will make you be able to do roof venting for both the shed dormer and I guess there won't be probably any drywall or any finish in there, so I guess that won't be a factor. Sorry, I'm thinking out loud.
I was going to say, he's not going to...
Yeah, I'm thinking like a house. Yeah.
So my first reaction is, if you're not going to condition the space, it'll be neither heated nor cooled with an air conditioner. In general, it's hard to change, to lower the temperature of a space without an air conditioner, with a few exceptions. I mean, attics are hot, and the temperature of an attic can be cooled by the use of a radiant barrier. So
what I was gonna
the
say.
first step is radiant barrier sheathing is an upcharge, but not a big upcharge from ordinary roof sheathing. So you buy that before you put on your roof sheathing. It's shiny side down, and there will be less radiant heat transfer from the roof sheathing to the attic space. Now, what happens in a long heat wave is if it's hot at night and hot during the day, the radiant sheathing is only works for short periods of time if you have a hot period of day for one afternoon and then it cools off at night. Otherwise, everything just gets hot. It never cools off. And it'll always be hot in that attic. So you can't expect a miracle from a radiant barrier or even from insulation for that matter. If you were to totally insulate this, any space gradually reverts to the average outdoor temperature, insulated or not, unless you have a heater or a cooling device inside the space.
So when does a radiant barrier sheathing make the most sense? Is it when you have a situation that also has indoor air conditioning, so that or an area where it's really hot during the day but cool at night?
Radiant barrier sheathing only makes sense in a shed like this, where you're not really conditioning the space. You just want to try to drop the temperature of the indoors for a few hours in the afternoon when the sun is the most intense. And that will be effective.
Okay.
Sometimes warehouses do it for that reason.
Gotcha.
If you're intending to insulate the space, you don't want a radiant barrier. Like if you invest $100 in insulation, you'll get a better effect than you will by investing $100 in a radiant barrier.
Okay.
You really want R value.
I hear Southern builders, though, say that attics are so much more comfortable in homes with installed radiant barriers.
Which brings me to the next exception, which I was leading up to, which is the other exception is if you make an error and put ducts or HVAC equipment in your attic, then you better put a radiant barrier sheathing above that attic. Now, we always say in Green Building Advisor, basically 4 times a day when the topic comes up, never put ducts
in the attic
or any kind of HVAC equipment in a vented,
Patrick is a
unconditioned
huge
attic.
fan of that building assembly. I just wanted to let you know.
But, but builders in Texas and Florida and Georgia don't listen to us.
Yeah,
they still do it. And it costs about 20 to 30% of your air conditioning bill. You're just wasting that by putting it through hot ducts in your attic. And the builder doesn't care because the builder doesn't pay the air conditioning bills. And that's for the life of the building. 20 to 30% of your dollars you're just throwing out the window.
Now, does the same apply for putting that stuff in the basement, a cold, unconditioned basement? It's got to be less.
To a lesser extent. I mean, most basements are conditioned according to the building code. Building codes now require conditioned basements, unless you're in some of the hottest parts of the country. And in the hottest parts of the country, they don't build basements.
Yeah.
And the dynamics are different between basements and attics for a bunch of reasons. This is mostly an air conditioning problem. And of course, attics are hotter than basements.
Yeah.
So those are the 2 reasons you might want a radiant barrier. Otherwise, most of the radiant barrier advertisements are exaggerations, and they're proposing applications that don't really work.
So if we looked at Tim's shed and he was gonna, let's say that he didn't use radiant barrier. Let's say that he wanted to solve the problem of the nails sticking through the roof sheathing and add some kind of resistance to the heat. Would it do anything for him to add, let's say, R20 worth of foil face polyiso insulation to the underside of the roof deck? Let's say he just cut and cobbled it, stuck it up there so that the nails were covered in the hopes that he would also get some thermal benefit.
He would actually get an even better benefit thermally because he'd get the radiant barrier and a little bit of R value. So if the shingles and the roof sheathing were very hot, as they would be on a hot afternoon, that would keep the little kids cooler. It would be a violation if that were in a house because that's a fire hazard. And if the kids become teenagers and start smoking up there, they could die in a tragic fire, and this particular person would never forgive him or herself. So
that's what I would have done.
So in theory,
you would have died in the fire?
Yeah.
In theory, you want to cover that with gypsum drywall. And gypsum drywall is relatively cheap, but at that point, now you've got insulation and gypsum drywall. It becomes pretty expensive for a shed or a playhouse. But I mean, the basic solution to the poking nails problem is called a ceiling. And if you're going to put up a ceiling anyway, you have to think, well, what kind of ceiling do I want? You can do a gypsum ceiling, you can do a plywood ceiling. If you've got some cheap boards that you have left over from another project, you can put up a board ceiling. But,
I would say tongue and groove boards on that are thicker, 2x stock, and then you could nail down your shingles without having the nails poke through if you didn't want to go to the trouble of insulating.
That's another approach.
You could also, just double up your sheathing with conventional sheathing.
And you could also...
But then you wouldn't get the radiant barrier.
You wouldn't get the radiant barrier.
Yeah.
All right.
No, the foam might be nice, though. I mean, it's going to be a lot more comfortable in there. And when your wife's mad at you, maybe you can go out there
and then sleep in the shed.
I mean, a lot of people are getting very cheap rigid foam used. They're buying it from a reclaimed,
Insulation Depot is where I got mine.
Right. And if you get a real truckload of cheap foam, you could put it above the roof sheathing. And then you'd need a second layer of sheathing if you're putting shingles on, or if you're putting metal roofing on, you could put metal roofing right on top of the foam. Then you wouldn't need the radiant barrier, and you could use your 2-inch thick sheathing approach. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it.
Let's talk about that for a second. We'll risk a little detour here. The reused polyiso, which it's mostly polyiso. People are
Actually, all three, XPS, EPS, and polyiso are available from these reclaimed.
And it's usually they're reclaiming them from commercial situations, especially roofs, is my understanding.
There's a lot of EPS on commercial roofs, believe it or not, but less than polyiso.
Okay, and you're essentially, from these reclaiming companies, you're paying them to buy a truckload of insulation, sometimes slightly randomized in thickness, sometimes
I think it's
consistent.
unfair to say a truckload because like a conventional tractor trailer holds
so much
insulation.
Okay.
So like mine, as an example, was 2.5 pallets, and they were the pallets are probably 8 foot, 7 foot tall.
And were you like one stop on the way to other places, or
my insulation was the only thing on the truck, and I think it was handled by an independent trucking company contracted from the insulation supplier.
Yeah.
They don't have their own trucks. They hire a freight company to bring it to you, and you can have a liftgate service if you want.
Yeah, very cool. It's a cool solution. Are you a fan? Where are you at right now with unvented versus vented roofs?
Either one works just fine as long as it's detailed properly.
Yeah, but which one do you like better?
Well, it depends on the house and what you want. I mean, I am a fan of vented conditioned attics with cellulose on the attic floor. I mean,
vented
unconditioned. Excuse me. Thanks for the correction. And there are a lot of reasons. It's cheap. It's durable. It allows you to inspect the underside of the roof sheathing for roof leaks. Mm-hmm. It's kind of problem free. But a lot of people want to finish the second story of their house because it's a place for an extra bedroom, and they end up having to insulate the roof slopes, make it to kind of cathedralize it. Yeah. And if they do that, then you often find that the roof configuration requires an unvented solution.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, unless you get it from these used places, I think any way you run the numbers, it's going to end up being more expensive to put your foam on the outside than to air seal, provide a vent space, and add cavity insulation of just about any kind on the inside.
Right, and the reason that more people don't do what you suggest is it's very rare these days to have a roof without valleys, hips, and dormers. And if you have valleys, hips, and dormers, you can't vent. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. It's a fair point, at least not effectively.
Right.
So next question from John about missing insulation. After buying our house, I noticed that one part of the roof is missing some insulation down near the eaves. I'd like to replace it with a couple of 4-foot-long rock wool bats, which I discovered thanks to the podcast. Here's my concern. The roof slopes through the second floor such that the distance from the attic floor down to the subfascia is approximately 6 feet, and there are numerous roofing nails sticking out up to maybe 1 inch. I'm uncertain how to push the first bat down to the edge of the roof line without compressing or tearing them by pushing on the end. So just to quickly stop and describe this, we got the attic floor is not at the level of where the bottom of the rafters is.
It's on the midspan of the rafter.
So you've got the rooms below have a little bit of a sloped ceiling around the outside of the house.
Like a classic cape.
Yeah. So he's wondering, how do I, without ripping into those walls, how do I slide insulation down to that bottom portion of the roof from the attic if all these nails are stuck in the way? Some details. Rafters are 2x6s, 20.5 on center. I'm pretty sure that means I'll have to cut down 23-inch bats, and the best I'll be able to use is R23, which is 5.5 inches thick. So some questions here. Is it even possible to install 4-foot bats to the end of a 6-foot cavity filled with nails without compromising R value? Or should I just give up and hire someone to blow in cellulose? My experience in this area so far is that anything that requires hiring a contractor means substantial cost and several months lead time, so I'd really like to do it myself. Thoughts, gentlemen?
Well, my first thought is he didn't mention ventilation baffles. So we should say right off the bat that you can't install any kind of fluffy insulation, which is the way I describe air-permeable insulation like fiberglass or rock wool. You can't install that between rafters unless you have a ventilation baffle, some physical barrier to separate the top of the insulation from the roof sheathing.
And that'll be of no use unless it has soffit and
Right.
ridge vents. So he's
Exactly.
going to have to add those as well.
So there are three elements of this system: the soffit vents, the ventilation baffles that maintain the gap, and the ridge vent.
I wonder if what's going on here is that was intentionally left. Well, first of all, if it was left uninsulated because it was hard to insulate in the first place,
Right.
or if it was left uninsulated. You know, sometimes these spots are left undone by some mistaken understanding that this is going to be the vent baffle. Like, we want to leave this area open so that the air flows through the soffit and up.
Well, lots of possibilities there. I mean, I suppose it's even possible that this sloped ceiling has rigid foam and this homeowner doesn't realize it. I doubt it.
Yeah.
I mean, if this were the ventilation baffle. So the basic question is, can I slide a bat through these nails? Is misguided, because what you're going to slide past those nails is the ventilation baffle you're
Right.
about to install. And once that's done, you have a smooth surface past which you hope to slide your
But it's only going to be
Insulation.
3.5 inches of insulation once you have the 2-inch airspace.
right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the larger question is, how should this type of sloped roof assembly be insulated? And there are lots of approaches. But assuming that we are going to go ahead with this plan, it needs the vent channel and then
What's the code for vent space these days?
1 inch minimum.
It's 1 inch. Okay.
And
2
Joe
inches, I
Stiebrick-
know what people are calling for, but
Yeah, Joe Stiebrick likes 2 inches, but
Yeah.
1 inch will work, at least for code. So, I mean, I could rephrase this whole question is like, can I slide ventilation baffles and insulation down from the attic through a sloped roof assembly towards the soffits? And the answer is it depends. I mean, the factors are, how cramped is your attic?
Yeah.
How much room do you have up there to work? And also, how good are you? This is kind of a
Fussy
it's
thing.
like an acrobatic trick in which a surgeon might be better than someone else. In other words, if you have a feel for wiggling things in tight spaces. I've talked to insulation contractors who say we do this all the time, and other people who say I tried it and I just couldn't get anything past it. And what the most frustrating thing I've ever done in my life. So,
Well, I mean,
if you're willing, you can try it, but this is not a foolproof way to insulate these spaces.
I think he's on the right track. If he's going to use any sort of fluffy insulation, as you call it, then rock wool is the way to go because it's much
More
firmer
rigid.
and rigid
Right.
than
If you're going to
fiberglass.
try to slide it, it would be Rockwell, although a lot of people put in the ventilation baffles and then blow cellulose.
Yes. Well, that would certainly
You
be.
can slide the hose down and then pull the hose back up.
Yep. It would be super easy with cellulose for sure.
But assuming you can find a way to get the ventilation baffles down, and you can make a rigid ventilation baffle out of thin plywood or even rigid foam with standoffs on each side and make it a little undersized so it slides easily. And then you can either, put some construction adhesive along the spacers and then put some wedges there so the construction adhesive holds, or you can just kind of wedge it in temporarily and blow cellulose and pull the wedges out as you pull the hose up.
Or you could take down the ceiling in the room below and practice your drywall.
Exactly.
I think, honestly, that's going to be his best approach.
I say this all the time. You should insulate by removing the drywall. And every single time I say this, people say, well, I can't do that.
Sure
That's
you
my
can.
daughter's bedroom. I can't touch it,
Sure you can. It's not that hard, actually.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
Drywall is one of the easiest things
That's
to,
how I would
to
do
have
it.
to deal with.
Right.
And it's a relatively small space, right?
Yeah.
It's not like it's the entire house.
No, I mean, you'd be making a cut along where that sloped ceiling,
I would
where it meets the
also-
ceiling, where it meets the wall, remove the panel, insulate, put it back up.
Right.
Depending on the longevity of his roof, it might make more sense to insulate on top.
Yes, and we actually have a great article about that will be in the next issue of the magazine. Mike Gerton did a venting from the top down approach. He combined it with a re-roofing project to illustrate how it was a tight low slope roof that he couldn't easily get down into the junction of the rafters and the
And he
attic
did it from
floor.
the top side by taking the roof sheathing off, right?
He just took off one row of roof sheathing.
Right.
Yep.
I would say John should also, when he pulls down his drywall, as he's inevitably going to have to do, definitely check out that connection between the floor joists and the rafters, right? It's quite conceivable this space was never meant to be living space. That's a tough connection to get right because it's
Yeah.
in shear.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Good point.
So let's just talk about that a little more too, because that's a couple of different things. It's in shear, and it's possible that it's undersized in terms of joists. It could have been sized as ceiling
Absolutely.
joists instead of.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't look like he's using it for much except a little bit of storage up there. I don't think, did he say that he was looking to move stuff up there, or he was just looking to insulate?
I'm not sure what
think it
his
was just looking to
intent was
insulate.
with the space,
Yeah.
but my guess is it was never meant for living space. So you'd want to check that out.
My thing to John is, because I just love little problem-solving things, and I would be tempted, if you're going to try this, to work out some kind of a solution where once I had that vent baffle in place, maybe it's something, it's going to be tough for like 4 feet, but something that you could compress the bats with. Like in a perfect world, it would be like sandwiching the bat between 2 pieces of
Like a
plywood or something.
panini press.
Yeah, squishing it down flat, sliding it into the place, and then pulling those 2 flattening
Yeah,
boards
good luck
out.
inventing
Yeah.
that. Come back and tell us when you finish
Yeah.
inventing that, Justin.
You would need to have some sort of
I don't think you could squeeze
Yeah.
rock wool. I think you could squeeze fiberglass that way, but I don't think you could make rock wool.
Well, it's also possible
It
you could
bounce
just
back.
use it as a separation so that you could
Yep.
slide it more easily and then pull the board out.
Because it's less friction.
Yeah, like a piece of sheet metal or something, I can imagine, or coil stock or something.
I'm going to make one other suggestion: is if Patrick's suggestion of removing the drywall is done, that gives you a lot of options, and it might be best to simply call up a spray foam contractor and install closed cell spray foam
Right
without
against the
vent
sheathing.
baffle, and then you'll have an unvented roof assembly, but you'll get much more R value because the closed cell spray foam has a high R value per inch, and you gain that extra 1.5 inches that the ventilation baffle would have taken up.
Here's what I would do. I got a new plan. I would fill this whole thing with rigid foam. I would use the rigid foam to create the vent space, put little standoffs on it, and then laminate on the other pieces of rigid foam
Slide it in
into
there.
one big piece.
That's called the cut and cobble method.
But you'd slide the whole thing down and fill up the cavity in one shot.
But how do you do the perimeter?
right.
for
The
good
trouble is
sealing?
you can't
You have
air
a
seal it.
trade-off.
If you can't,
Can't air seal a regular barrier either,
if
though.
you can't air seal
bad, I
around
mean.
the rigid foam, it's kind of greatly compromised in performance because what you have is air traveling through that cavity. You're inviting the air into that cavity, and if it goes on the sides of the foam and between the gaps of the foam, it's carrying the heat of the house with it.
But your suggestion was to slide these furring strips down and apply adhesive to strips before you put them in, and then push it up against the roof sheathing to create a seal, right?
That was one of my suggestions.
So you could do the same thing with the rigid foam.
kind of. I can't see how you can seal it right and left.
Yeah, you'd be sealing it against the roof
And
deck.
cut and cobble over time often creates cracks and
Yeah.
gaps because the rafters change as humidity changes. So I think cellulose does a much better job of preventing air movement than the cut and cobble method with rigid foam.
All right. Sorry, John.
Poor John.
Time to start looking up some drywall articles.
Gonna have to get that drywall now.
Yeah. All right. Now we're moving on to more insulation and air sealing for a change of pace. But this is one that I'm so glad that somebody wrote about, and I'm so glad we have Martin here for it because it's about a seasonal cabin. And I've always been super curious from a building point of view, like from a building health and science point of view, how to do this kind of thing correctly and keep your house safe.
Because Martin lives in a seasonal cabin, right?
No, Martin lives in a cabin that's 4 seasons. I forgot to put a name on this, but I'm updating my family camp in the northern Adirondacks, which is climate zone 6, that was built in the early 1900s. We primarily use the camp from May to Labor Day, with occasional ski trips in the winter. Heating is handled by wood stove and propane heaters, and the water is turned off in the winter. We recently had the 1,700 square foot cottage seated on techno metal posts and I-beams as the foundation. We replaced the failing floor structure with new 2x8s, and we have exterior XPS rigid foam. We also rebuilt the entire roof assembly from the sills up using 2x6 rafters, and then 1x6 pine decking with closed cell spray foam, synthetic underlayment, and a metal roof. Perhaps we should have changed some of these details, but they are done now. Anyway, my question has to do with updating the wall assembly in the coming months. The current assembly is 2x4 walls with pine clapboard siding, lead paint, and simple wainscot inside, with little more than mouse dung as insulation. So, I'm going to skim through a little bit of this because it's...
Is this the same climate zone where you live, Martin? Are you in 6?
It's close. Oh yeah, same zone by number.
So his question is, what his plan is to remove the cladding, install and tape zip system sheathing against the exterior studs, then outside of the zip system, install 2 staggered layers of foil-faced 1.5-inch XPS, then 1x3 furring strips, siding, and then on the inside, fill the stud bays with rock wool and finish with tongue and groove boards. So
I love the assembly for one detail, excepting one detail.
Without the drywall.
There's no drywall.
Yeah,
There's no air barrier.
He could use a membrane
He could also put up T111 or some other similar kind of panel product and, seal the seams
on the inside.
on the inside.
Yeah. Of course, it has the inevitable question of, do I need a vapor barrier here, which that you must answer 12 times a day on Green Building Advisor.
Well, my reaction, the original question referred to the exterior foam as 1.5 a foil-faced 1.5 XPS rigid foam, and I was a little confused by that because XPS really isn't available with foil facing, or if so, it's a very unusual product.
Yes.
Generally, if it's foil-faced, it's probably polyiso.
It could be EPS too.
It could be foil-faced EPS, which is also sold. It's probably not XPS. So briefly, I don't really care from a performance standpoint which of these products you use. Even if there's foil facing or no foil facing, for this application, it doesn't matter. But XPS in general is avoided by green builders. And coincidentally, this same question was posted on our website. So the person was looking for a green building solution. So the green building answer is choose EPS or polyiso because those are manufactured with benign blowing agents, and XPS is manufactured with a blowing agent that is very harmful because it has a high global warming potential, I think 1,000 times higher than the global warming potential of CO2. So we try to avoid it.
Or if you can use XPS, go get the recycled stuff.
Or get the recycled stuff.
But in any case, isn't this not enough rigid foam for that climate?
No, it's enough for this climate. So actually, it's a great approach to an assembly. If you get 3 inches, it's 2 layers. So it's a 3-inch total. So that would be 3 inch. That would be R15. I have to look it up.
I thought it had to be more than 20. Oh, that's for a roof.
Well, it depends on the studs, too. Are these 2x4s? They're 2x4 walls. So it's a ratio. So you need thinner exterior foam with 2x4 walls than you do with 2x6 walls.
I think that's the thing that I continuously forget when I'm thinking about how much exterior foam, and maybe some other people get caught up with this too, is it's not just pick the number that keeps the sheathing warm. It's the ratio of impermeable to permeable, right?
We should tell people
why
that is, because you're creating a condensing surface if you don't have enough foam. Is that correct?
Right. You don't want cold sheathing because that's what accumulates moisture over the winter.
Right.
Some people call it condensation, but it's actually a type of sorption. What happens is the sheathing takes on moisture. Now, in a conventional wall, that moisture dissipates in the spring. When the sun comes out and the weather warms up, it dries to the exterior through the house wrap and the siding. But once you put an impermeable layer of rigid foam, you have no exterior drying. It can stay damp much longer. So that's why the thickness matters. And the interior fluffy insulation, usually fiberglass, but sometimes rock wool, keeps the sheathing cool. So the ratio matters. The thinner the interior insulation, the safer. And the thicker the rigid foam, the safer.
And that applies to roofs as well?
That applies to roofs as well. And the ratios are different because of the stack effect makes roof sheathing much more vulnerable than wall sheathing.
Can I ask a silly question here? Is all of this discussion academic with so little use of this building? It's not like someone's living there all the time.
Well, that's where it gets weird for me, is like, the cabins have always been an odd thing to me, and I've always wanted to ask the question, because they have such drastic swings in temperature, like especially people that have seasonal cabins that they shut down for the winter. And then you're coming back in the spring and you're like turning everything on and taking it from 0 degrees to 68 degrees, like in the same day. And then at the end of the season, you're dropping it back down to 0. And
well, Patrick's got the better question. Justin's worry is not important.
It's not a worry?
Because sudden changes don't hurt the assembly. But Patrick put his finger on an important point, which is without the winter moisture loading, which this cabin right now doesn't have, the risk is quite low. The trouble with making a recommendation for a building is you don't know what the future use will be. And lots of summer camps have been converted to year-round homes. I see it all the time in Vermont. People built lake cabins and, 50 years ago, and it was just a little family retreat, and now somebody wants to live there year-round. So I think it's best to plan a wall system so it would be robust enough to get through a winter, even if the winter was conditioned.
And the building code is starting to reflect more and more of that kind of stuff. And this is an unrelated example, but the last time I was building a deck or a porch, actually the last 2 times, they made me size the footings with the assumption that it would one day have a roof and living space above the deck. Like
because
some kind of a
happens.
balcony, or they just have learned from that you're going to have to build this to be ready for somebody else who might want to do that later.
I would want the inspector to show me where that is in the code because that is BS.
Okay, leaving aside the code issue. And my guess is a camp in the Adirondacks may be located somewhere where there's no building codes that apply at all,
Well, there's certainly not going to be any enforcement, right? You're going to do whatever you want.
So ultimately, if you know for a fact that you are willing to build a camp that will work for summer applications but may not be as robust in the winter, and you take that risk, then go right ahead. It's your place. You can do what you want, as long as you know what happens in winter.
So we're all in agreement, though, for the most robust assembly, they would want some kind of interior air barrier.
Right. Now, if he follows through with his outside zip sheathing taped at the seams, he's got a robust exterior air barrier. So the question arises, do you need a double air barrier? Mm-hmm. And I often say it can't hurt. I mean, whenever someone says tongue and groove boards will be my interior finish, there's a red flag.
Sure. Yeah.
Because if there were no air barrier on the outside, that's a very leaky wall assembly, and you're going to have terrible performance and possible condensation problems. But with exterior rigid foam and taped zip sheathing, you're not going to have much air flow through that assembly. The only risk is if you have electrical outlets that are leaky near the bottom and the top plate is not sealed well and there's air leakage to the attic, you might get an airflow loop that happens all winter long, and there might be some components of this wall that are cold enough to cause moisture accumulation. However, with the 3 inches of exterior rigid foam, you've kind of planned for that, and there's no cold surfaces. So you get a slight degradation in thermal performance, but it really isn't huge. All of that said, remember, folks, when you're putting up tongue and groove boards, you want to have an air barrier behind it in most cases. In this case, maybe not, but I would do it, which I always say the cheapest is just tape drywall.
You can also use these kind of cardboard materials I've seen used for behind tub enclosures and that thermoply.
Thermoply, that's it.
And you tape the seams and handle it. And my guess it would be a faster and easier installation than drywall,
and maybe
it
even
might
cheaper.
work for this
Is it
instance.
It's cardboard?
It's cardboard with a foil on it, as I recall.
Thermoply, yeah.
Yeah. Just to circle back on what you were saying about drastic changes aren't a big concern. That's just because, in general, building scientists aren't worried so much about the anomaly. They're worried about the long problems.
Well, you're worried about moisture accumulation in general. So let's just say that the building is cold and you come in the spring and you heat it up.
Yeah.
I mean, if anything, heating up is going to drive away the moisture. I'm just saying it doesn't tend to hurt a building.
Okay.
It's dry if there's no human occupants, and it's dry when you move in and heat it up. Funny things can happen to an unoccupied house. I mean, the classic example is if you have a big stone chimney in the middle of your house, which I happen to have, and your house is unoccupied for a month in winter, and you come back and that chimney is cold, and then it's a spring day and you open up the windows, that chimney is going to start to drip water. I mean, that is only happening because of seasonal usage and suddenly the weather has changed. But it only happens once because from then on, you're kind of keeping the space at a comfortable human temperature.
Okay.
And it doesn't cause long-term damage.
So maybe if you have a hunting cabin that you're going to only on the weekends throughout the season, you might see some moisture accumulation here and there. But okay. This is my favorite question yet.
Cool.
Waterproofing a permanent wood foundation. Kyla writes, my wife and 2 kids, my wife and 2 kids, live in a log home built on top of a PWF, permanent wood foundation, in climate zone 6A, which is Wisconsin. We're currently addressing the foundation as the home was built in 1980 and needs some attention. In the front of the house, the PWF is about 2 foot 6 inches above grade, and as you make your way to the back of the house, it's 4 foot 6 above grade. Currently, it's sided with pressboard siding, which is more than likely original, as it is not looking so good. Since it's a log home, we're trying to replace elements that require little maintenance, as maintaining the logs is enough work in itself. I love that. So we're leaning towards corrugated steel siding to replace the pressboard. Currently, there's nothing between the siding and the PWF sheathing, which is treated plywood. Where the siding ends, which is right above grade, there is black poly that has scrap pieces of plywood strapping securing it to the PWF. My assumption is that this is continued down to the base of the foundation. All right, we'll circle back on the particulars of a
PWF,
but let's just get to his quick options here before we move on. First option, excavate around the house, apply new 6 mil poly right below the logs, then 1x3 strapping horizontally, which will be used to fasten the corrugated steel siding. Then, obviously, properly flash from where the logs and foundation meet over the top of the corrugated steel. Option 2, instead of poly, use a dimpled foundation mat. Apply that the whole height of the foundation wall, and then could you fasten corrugated steel siding directly over the top of the dimpled mat since it would have a drainage plane behind it? Or would I still want or need to attach some strapping? The challenge with no strapping is I would need to go through the corrugated steel siding and make sure to hit the PWF studs, which are 12 inches on center. There's 3 options. Third option, install poly, then the dimpled mat over the poly. At that point, should I install the dimpled mat starting at 6 inches above grade? That might be more of a pain as the foundation above grade changes from the front to the back. So basically, his question boils down to like,
how do I treat this?
How do I treat this? And I'm sure that there are people listening to this going, what the hell is a permanent wood foundation? Jeff has one in his house, but no, he doesn't. Permanent wood foundation is code approved as far as last I saw in the code anyway. It's a alternative to a concrete or whatever other foundation you want to use, and it's got its own special characteristics.
It's got a high preservative treatment, right?
Yeah, don't quote me on all the details, but I believe what it is essentially a stud wall that goes below grade, and you have to cover it with pressure-treated sheathing, or at least the top part that protects the wall up where the grade, between the grade and the siding, has to be pressure-treated.
Complete pressure-treated sheathing.
The whole thing does?
Yep, pressure-treated plywood.
And you also have to have a 6 mil poly on it as well, right?
As far as I know, that's correct.
That's as far as
all stainless steel nails and very specific drainage details.
Why do you know about this?
Well, because we get these questions.
I'm just curious.
No, I've never built one.
I've never seen one.
You have to have crushed stone under the entire foundation and crushed stone backfill along with robust drainage details. And when people say, oh, it works, a lot of people point out, well, one of the reasons it works is it's got really wonderful drainage details.
Sure, what wouldn't work if you put it there?
Yeah, exactly. And any foundation works well with great drainage details.
Yeah.
But, can I respond to this?
Absolutely.
One of the great things about all of these suggestions is this homeowner is suggesting excavating down to the footings.
Yes.
So once you're excavating down to the footings, it's a wonderful opportunity to put exterior rigid foam.
I was going to say the mineral wool is ideal for this application too, right? Because it's got good drainage.
And it doesn't care about being wet.
So let's call it continuous exterior insulation, which is by far the best way to insulate this type of foundation.
Well, with a caveat of no polyiso, though, right?
No polyiso.
Because we don't want that below grade ever.
Right. So, well, it can be kind of below grade on the inside of your house, but not below grade on the outside.
Can't be touching dirt below grade.
Right.
How about that?
So EPS, XPS, or mineral wool.
Yep.
And, you know, the designers of the PWF system suggest using fiberglass between the studs to insulate. And that's problematic because you often get moisture dripping down the back of the fiberglass when you do that because, of course, the foundation is cold, whether it's concrete or made out of plywood. So they solve this detail by like keeping the fiberglass up a little and leaving air gaps and hoping enough air will dry out the condensation. But this is the Achilles heel of all permanent wood foundations, is insulating between the studs is very bad.
Their solution is to leave an air gap between the insulation and the wall.
And definitely between the bottom plate and the insulation. The idea is, you know, they're aware of this problem. They have a solution which is not building science based. So
it's also not help. It's also completely rendering the insulation pointless.
Exactly. So
it doesn't get wet.
Putting a continuous layer of exterior insulation would be step one.
Yeah.
And I would say with or without the dimple mat. The dimple mat is great. Dimple mats improve the drainage, although if this is a permanent wood foundation, I should say, and it's already got, you know, crushed stone around the exterior, you may not need the dimple mat.
I would suggest this is a great opportunity for a spray-applied waterproofing membrane and then either mineral or fiberglass insulation.
That would work too.
Yeah.
Are the foundation coatings different than what you would spray on the walls for fluid-applied weather-resistive barrier?
All I can say is they look exactly the same, but I
Yeah.
bet there's probably some
I'm
differences.
sure that the thickness must be different.
You would want to choose a product that the manufacturer said is appropriate for below
Wood,
grade use.
and wood.
And wood. So
Yeah.
you'd have to research that, but I think those exist.
Yeah. I love the dimple mat solution. I mean, I've always, anytime that I've used that or seen other people use it, it just seems like a dynamite product. It's got, because of the nature of the dimples, it has drainage on both sides of it.
It's expensive.
It's expensive, but
So
I mean, you're already digging down to the footing.
So if this person is choosing to install some type of steel siding, which is fine with me if that's what they like, they'll probably use some stainless steel screws to attach it. And I don't think they have to hit the studs. I think
don't
they could
either.
go through the plywood.
And I think most steel roofing
Yeah.
is rated for sheathing attachment only. You don't have to fasten it. To
So
Do
if
we think this is half-inch sheathing? It probably is,
it's
right?
at least half inch. It might even be 3/4. You would have to look up what the PWF specs call for. But if you've got pressure-treated plywood foundation, screw to the plywood and don't worry about the studs.
Yeah, I mean, even if the manufacturer of the siding says you need to hit the studs, let's apply some just
Common sense.
common sense here. Where's the siding going to go? It's
Right.
pinched between dirt and a wall.
Right. What's below grade is already obviously held by the backfill. And what's
Yeah.
above grade, the exposure isn't much, and I think you'll be fine with the
Yeah.
sheathing. There we go.
I agree.
So what do we think about permanent wood foundations generally?
Yes.
Can we get to that part?
I just like the idea of this gap between the bats. That's like saying, I insulated my house by leaning a bundle of insulation against the wall outside.
Well, I need to go back and reread the PWF insulation details before I misquote their recommendation. There's some type of gap recommended, and I don't think they have thought through the building science behind their recommendation to use fluffy insulation between the studs. So, and in terms of pressure-treated wood foundations, I would say if you can insulate it on the exterior, I think there's nothing wrong with them, except a lot of people who sell their homes find that some buyers don't want to buy them.
Sure, it's scary.
So if you care about resale value and you want to sell your house fast, when you move, a concrete foundation is going to sell faster.
Have you guys ever seen one of these in real life?
I have not.
And I just wonder if they're still being constructed. It's
They are.
interesting to me.
I wonder if there's a cost savings. I mean, I guess there
I
would
think that's
be.
the whole reason.
Right.
Well, there's some people. What was the other thing I read about them was that the wood is.
Has less embodied energy.
No, well, sure, that's one thing too. That's actually a great answer, but it's also less thermally conductive than masonry.
And I don't know why that matters if you
I don't
insulate.
know why either, but-
and there are places like in rural Canada or where it's hard to get a concrete truck.
Yeah.
If you are building in a very remote location and the nearest ready-mix plant is a long ways away or there is none at all, then this might be a great way to put in a foundation.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I
nice.
was going to say, why not use a slab? But if you don't have access to concrete,
Right.
that's not going to work
Right.
either.
Yeah. Maybe it's what you're comfortable with. They don't want to have to learn how to stack blocks or
Right.
I think
just
for
frame another stud wall.
I would love to see some excavated and see how they held up. I don't want to dismiss them out of hand.
As
but
far
it's
as I know,
a
they hold
wacky,
up fine.
It's a wacky idea to me.
Right. They've been engineered and they've been around for decades, so I don't think it's a durability issue.
As long as you get that, as long as you have the foundation figured out, it's not that much different than like a fence post, I guess. I mean, you put the right gravel around it and the water's not going to get to it.
Except it's a lot easier to replace a fence post than a foundation.
And I should point out there are some people who don't like the idea of having that much pressure-treated wood inside their living space. Of course, you can put drywall up or you can cover it, but some people think it might be toxic. And we've had different ways to pressure treat wood over the years. But the older foundations may have had
I think these have to be CCA.
they've had some arsenic in them. And the question is, do you want your kids playing in the basement if there's arsenic in the walls? So that's another issue.
Somebody send us a letter if you're the one building a permanent wood foundation.
Yeah,
we
I'd
want
love to
see
talk
some
to you.
photos. Is that everything? That's everything. We did a whole show. Well, Martin, thank you for joining us for this wonderful episode. If anybody has any other questions, please hop on to greenbuildingadvisor.com and direct your questions to the Q&A section. Martin will be happy to point you in the right direction, or somebody else will. Or send them to us at fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can visit us on the website at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Until next time, this is Justin for Patrick and Martin saying keep craft alive and happy building.